Great.
We're trying to make sure we can figure out how this recording works.
Should I launch in, or do you want to say anything?
I just want to give a brief introduction. Many of you are in the History 112 class, so you have met Dr. Morgan Pitelka before. He is coming to us from the UNC Carolina Asia Center, where he's the director and also a professor of Asian Studies and History. I'm getting that correct. Today he's talking about Meiji restoration in Japan. I had the privilege of hearing this morning. It's a great talk. You'll love it. I will let him take over.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me again. When I was here last time, I talked to you about the Tokugawa period and the idea of the floating world. Remember this culture of sort of red light districts and nightlife. In a way, I want to start in that same period, in the Tokugawa period. But instead of in the age when that culture was flourishing, I want to talk to you today about the end of the Tokugawa period. The Tokugawa period is Japan's last feudal dynasty, its last pre-modern age. So I'll be talking to you about the age when the samurai were still in power, but their days were numbered, when Japan was right on the verge of entering into the modern world. So this is a slide I showed you the last time I was here. Oh, there's no slides. Darn. Okay, I think that's my fault. I can fix that. So I'm about to show you a slide of the Tokugawa period showing a department store, a pre-modern version of a department store in which you can see men and women in old-fashioned dress shopping for goods in the city of Edo. Now remember, Edo is the name for Japan's capital city. Today we call it Tokyo, but in the Tokugawa period it was still called Edo, and it was one of the largest cities in the world. And this department store, the Echigoya, was founded in the 17th century and was still thriving at the end of the Tokugawa period. Today it's a huge modern department store called Mitsukoshi. So one of the challenges for the Tokugawa government, the samurai government that ruled Japan, was that the men and women who ran these department stores, the members of the merchant class, were getting richer and richer with every year. They engaged in commercial activities. They had various mechanisms for profiting from their business activities. But the samurai had no way of making more money. They received a fixed stipend just for being samurai, which sounds like a pretty good deal to me. But their stipend, their salary never went up. So the merchant class is getting richer and richer, and the samurai, who are supposed to be in charge, in relative terms, are getting poorer. So that's one source of tension in the Tokugawa period, kind of pushing at this system and making it start to wobble, right? So what did the samurai do? Well, one of the answers to their increasing financial problems was to raise taxes on agriculturalists, to collect more money from peasants. Actually, not money, but rice, to ask the rice farmers to pay more of their yield. This, in turn, led to hardship among members of the agriculturalist class. So peasants increasingly protested what they felt was unfair treatment by their samurai overlords. And these protests increased over time between 1830, 1836, towards into the 1840s and 1850s. You see more and more large protests occurring in the countryside with hundreds and then thousands and ultimately tens of thousands of participants. So I think we sometimes have in our mind this notion that the Japanese people are very docile and obedient. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. We see in the end of the Tokugawa period that this social and political system that is kind of starting to teeter is being challenged by agriculturalists, by people at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. So there's pressure from within, but there's also pressure from without. So one of the things that's important to remember about the Tokugawa period is they had a closed country policy that limited their contact with foreign nations. This is really one of the key things about Tokugawa Japan that makes it special, is that they recognized the threat of Western and in fact, Christian culture. They recognized that the things that they heard were happening in the New World, in the Americas, for example, or in other parts of Asia, the Spanish conquering the Philippines, that could happen in Japan. And they kicked Europeans out in the 17th century and closed their borders. They didn't allow their own merchants to travel overseas. Japanese people could not leave the country for hundreds of years. And that worked in the 1640s. But in the 18-teens, 1820s, 1830s, the world was changing, right? The nations of Europe, the United States, were beginning to go through the Industrial Revolution. They were building bigger and larger ships, and they were sailing farther and farther away from their own borders. And they were especially active in the northern parts of the Pacific Ocean. Does anyone have an idea what would have drawn American vessels into the northern part of the Pacific? Any ideas? Trade? Wars? Hunting? Whales. That's exactly right. So whales were one of the most important products in the world in the 19th century because whale blubber, the fat that keeps these enormous, incredible animals insulated and warm even in the freezing waters of the Arctic, could be boiled down to produce an oil that was used in lamps. So this is right before the Industrial Revolution, right before electricity starts to become a part of daily life. So in every household in America, when the sun goes down, you want to keep working, you want to read, you want to spend time with your family, you light your oil lamp. And it's filled with oil made from whale blubber. So the ships of American vessels, or the ships of the American whale hunting fleets are heading out into the Pacific with increasing frequency. And that brings them to Japan, right? If you think about it, we might think of Japan as being on the other side of the planet. Japan is actually our neighbor. If you travel across the Pacific Ocean from California and you aim just right, you hit Japan. So in some ways, this contact between America and Japan in the 19th century was inevitable. First, the British started to knock on the door of the Tokugawa government's closed country policy. You may remember the Dutch were the one European power that Japan engaged in exchange with. There was a very small island in Nagasaki Harbor where the Japanese allowed some Dutch merchants to live. And in 1844, the Dutch petitioned the Tokugawa to open up their doors to the outside world. The Dutch basically said, the world is changing, the system of diplomacy is changing, you cannot be isolated forever, you should trade, you should exchange ambassadors with other nations. And at that time, the Tokugawa said, no, we're not interested. But change was, at this point, inevitable. And it's interesting that ultimately, the country that brought about this transformation for Japan was the United States. So this man, the American Commodore, member essentially of the Navy, William Perry, was charged with leading an embassy to Japan in 1853. And he traveled with this small fleet of the black ships, as they're known in Japan. These are ships that are partially industrialized, right? So you can see they have sails. They might look like the old traditional galleons that European explorers sailed around the globe. But this one has a steam engine. I lost my mouse. There it is. This one has a steam engine in it. You can see the smokestacks. And they're black because they're armored. They're metal. They're not completely metal. They're also made of wood. But these are new machines, the likes of which the Japanese have never seen. And Japan's very small armory of weapons, which are mostly from the 16th and 17th centuries, cannot dent these black ships. These are new, much more powerful vessels than the Japanese are familiar with. And so they basically have to allow Perry in to negotiate. They can't say no. So this is the way they represent Perry. Look at this portrait. So here's a photograph. Here's the Japanese way of drawing this foreign barbarian. He's basically represented as a tengu, as a goblin, a mythological creature who is a monster. And I think this is a really helpful reminder that to the Japanese in the 19th century, Europeans were not elevated above them. They were perhaps scary, but they were barbarous foreigners, dangerous others. So the notion that there was a kind of hierarchy in the world, Japan did not buy into that hierarchy, at least not at this moment in time. So Perry said, I'm going to come back in a couple of years with a bigger fleet, with more guns, and you will have to sign a treaty with us or suffer the consequences. And the Japanese were thrown into disarray. This completely destabilized their whole political system because the government's claim that it protected the Japanese people from foreigners was no longer true, right? And so this man, Townsend Harris, became the first consul general, the first sort of ambassador to Japan, and began negotiating in 1856 what would ultimately become the unequal treaties. Now, the unequal treaties were signed between Japan and America, as well as other great powers in Europe, and forced the opening of 8 Japanese ports to trade. So the closed country policy is destroyed. Please.
I have a question. What is the Japanese relationship with the United States? Because I would find that to have to go through something like this, which is something that wasn't a choice,
Right.
and being forced to open up their space with the society that they didn't want to, especially in such treacherous means, that the relationship wouldn't be very hospitable.
It's a great question. Let me try to come back to that throughout my comments today, and we'll talk about it more. I mean, in a way, the brief answer is Japan's relationship with America and with the West swung back and forth like a pendulum. There were certain periods when Japan was enamored with the West, and there were other periods when Japan saw the West as a threat. And it changed depending on who was in power. So one of the key parts of these treaties that Japan signed is that they were unequal. This was not a relationship between two governments that were peers. This was the relationship between a great power and an inferior. And this was made clear through the provision of what's called extraterritoriality. And what this word means is that if you committed a crime as an American in Japan, the Japanese government did not have the right to try and punish you according to Japanese law. Instead, you were returned to America to be tried as the American government saw fit. So the merchants from America, from France, from Great Britain that set up shop in Japanese port cities felt proud and confident and a certain sense of hubris that they were superior to the Japanese, and that they could get away with things that they couldn't get away with even in their own home country. And the Japanese were desperate to change this relationship. They did not want to be a colony. They did not want to have their people and their resources extracted from their borders, as was happening all over the world, right? Great Britain brutally ruled parts of India, South Asia, parts of Africa, was in the midst of the kind of aftermath of the Opium Wars with China. The Dutch had brutally ruled parts of Indonesia, right? So there were all these examples of the so-called great powers behaving in very exploitative ways that the Japanese were becoming aware of. And they wanted to avoid that fate. They did feel a sense of resentment towards America. But remember, the Tokugawa are still in charge at this moment in time. But their power is being threatened because any claim they have to legitimacy is really crumbling. So one of the responses to this Western invasion, if you will, is nativism. So nativism refers to a conservative, nationalist turn inward. When confronted by people from the outside, in this case, the threat of Western exploitation, some intellectuals, some samurai, argued that Japan needed to return to its traditions and strengthen its cultural core in order to resist foreign aggression. So this phrase, son no joi, revere the heavenly sovereign, that's not God, that's the emperor. So revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, kick out the Westerners, became a phrase, a rallying cry for nativists who wanted to resist Western imperialism. Now, the popular response was just one of confusion. Regular people, farmers, villagers, merchants, artisans, would hear news that there were these foreign barbarians selling goods in the port cities and walking around the cities of Japan. But they often didn't encounter any foreign merchants themselves. But there was this sense of collapse, and there was a widespread pandemonium when rumors spread that these amulets, these sacred amulets, were falling from the sky with ill omens written on them. And people were so freaked out by this, by all the changes that were happening in their society, that you had these spontaneous riots where people would chant, "E janaika, e janaika, e janaika," which basically means, it's translated here as "ain't it grand," but it basically means, "what the hell?" Or, everything's crazy. And they would dance in the street and break down the doors to shops, and this is kind of like the way people act after the Super Bowl, like it's like, turn over the cars, woo, all the rules are broken for tonight. But here it was less a celebration and more a sense that no one knew what tomorrow would bring. It was born of a sense of fear. Almost inevitably, this led to the collapse of the Tokugawa government. Now, there's a lot of text on this slide. Please don't worry about writing this all down. I'll share the slides with your instructor, and if you want to take a look at this later, you're welcome to. But basically what happened is Japan underwent a revolution, but it was not a revolution from below. So the peasants did not rise up and overthrow the samurai. Instead, a group of samurai decided that the Tokugawa were no longer effectively leading Japan. And so three of the feudal domains that had sworn fealty to the Tokugawa but never really were sort of vassals of the Tokugawa family, conspired to come up with a solution to the problem that Western imperialism posed. They went to Kyoto, where the emperor lived, and entered the imperial palace. And the young 15-year-old emperor, who was a boy, right? They held up as the new sovereign ruler of Japan. And they basically argued, the Tokugawa have lost their legitimacy. We need to return the nation to its old imperial roots, where the emperor, instead of being a figurehead who just is a religious ruler or a symbolic ruler, has real political power. And the shogun, on their orders, not the shogun, excuse me, the emperor, on their orders, abolished the position of shogun. So he basically said the Tokugawa family no longer has the right to rule the government. And he constituted a new army called the Royal Army from all the samurai who had put him in power. And they marched towards Edo. Now, this could have been the moment when Japan erupted in a civil war, but that's not what happened. Instead, the Tokugawa evacuated. The Tokugawa shogun said the Tokugawa did its best to rule Japan in peace and prosperity for centuries. Now the emperor has asked us to leave our position, and we renounce any claim of political power. So they withdrew from Edo. There were some pro-Tokugawa forces who fought against the royal army. So for example, here we see a woodblock print showing the aftermath of a battle, a famous battle, the Battle of Ueno. But on the whole, the Tokugawa order collapsed, and this new Meiji emperor came to power with very little bloodshed. Unlike the Civil War in the United States, for example, that tore the country apart with such incredible loss of life, this was a revolution that we don't call a revolution, and instead we call it a restoration. The idea being that the Meiji emperor is restored to power as the rightful head of the nation. Yeah?
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm following this correct. The shoguns were samurai.
Yes.
So half of the samurai went to the emperor and said, we want you to put your power. The other half stayed, and that's who had to evacuate.
Basically, yeah. I mean, there were samurai rulers all over Japan who didn't take part in any of this, who were bystanders. If the Tokugawa had tried to rally all of their vassals and all of their armies from all over Japan to resist this group who had the emperor, I think it could have been a devastating civil war. And it's worth noting that that didn't happen. So what did happen? Japan entered a new age in 1868. This is the beginning of what's called the Meiji period. And it's one of the most remarkable periods in all modern human history. We so often read the story of colonization, of resource extraction. In so many parts of the world, the superior technology of Europe, or in some cases the United States, leads to these profoundly unequal relationships that have long-term devastating effects, right? Japan avoids that fate because of the actions that occurred during the Meiji period. And it's part of what shapes the modern world that we live in. So, from the very beginning, the samurai who are in charge of this revolution recognized that turning the emperor into a modern monarch who can be a symbol of Japan's goal of becoming a strong, powerful nation is key. So the Charter Oath of 1868 first sets out the goal that Japan will have an open government with open assemblies for the people and by the people. It's not quite a commitment to democracy, but it's a commitment to openness that the Tokugawa never embraced. They have a provisional constitution written in several months, and the Grand Council of State, the Dajokan, is formed, in which the key samurai and aristocratic sort of movers and shakers behind the Meiji Restoration become a group of oligarchs who advise the emperor. So the truth is, the emperor does not have real political power. He's a figurehead. This Grand Council of State is the real ruling power. And it's an oligarchy. It's a group of men who are not elected, but who control the government. So they face a dilemma. Edo is the city of the Tokugawa. It's the largest city in Japan. It's a thriving commercial center. It has a castle at the center that's a perfect headquarters for the new government. But it was built by Tokugawa Ieyasu. And they want to move away from the history of the Tokugawa. So they engage in classic political kind of magic trick. They rename Edo. They call it Tokyo, which literally translates as Eastern Capital. And they move the emperor from Kyoto, the old imperial home, to this new city, Tokyo. So they rebrand the Tokugawa city to make it their own. And then they begin the process of modernizing the nation. So for example, the domains that were ruled by feudal warlords are converted over a period of 2 years into prefectures. Prefectures are like states or provinces, basically. So they start to dismantle the feudal political structure that the Tokugawa had used to rule for 2.5 centuries. Now the problem is that the Japanese have been closed off from the outside world for more than 200 years, right? They don't actually know very much about the West, about industrialization, about modern militaries. They don't know how to be modern. So they engage in the sort of greatest study abroad trip you can imagine, and they send this mission of leaders from the Meiji Restoration on a trip around the world. Now this is 1871, so they travel by steamship from Japan across the Pacific to San Francisco. In 1871, San Francisco is this thriving Wild West city that has been enriched by the gold rush and by the kind of agricultural boom that's starting to happen in the American West. And they study everything they can. They want to visit schools. They want to visit banks. They want to visit post offices. They want to visit prisons, right? They want to see all the institutions that a modern society has. Please.
So they didn't go to San Francisco before the gold rush, or didn't take part in it alongside the Chinese?
It was after. Although there are still vestiges of that happening in the American West. So this is just a small group of leaders, though, right? They then travel by train across America. They go to Chicago. They go ultimately to Washington, D.C. And again, they're studying. They're absorbing information and trying to learn about how modern Western institutions work. When they're in Washington, D.C., they petition the government to change the terms of the unequal treaty to recognize Japan as a peer. And of course, the U.S. says, no, you're not a peer. You're not modern. You're not powerful. So it's a very cutthroat diplomatic world. They then travel from the East Coast to England. England, of course, at this moment in time, rules probably the largest empire in the world. And so they go to Liverpool, the industrial capital of England. They go to London. And they're noticing that in America, you don't have a king, you don't have a queen. But in England, you have a monarchy. England is both modern and traditional. And so they start to get ideas about how to set up a government that fits Japan. They travel to Europe, to mainland Europe. They travel to Prussia, across the continent, down through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal. They visit India, and they see the Portuguese colonized city of Goa. They visit the British Raj, British India. They travel through Southeast Asia. And everywhere they go, they see that these powerful Western nations have colonies. They have conquered less powerful cultures, and they rule them, and they extract resources out of them, right? So again, try to put yourself in the position of the Japanese in 1871, 1872, 1873. They have been forced to sign unequal treaties. They want to self-strengthen. And what they see in powerful nations are certain characteristics that they want to reproduce in their own country. In other words, they want to become a great power like England, like America, like the Dutch. And that becomes their new goal. So the first thing that they need is a military. They already have the samurai, right? About 10% of the population consists of members of the samurai class. These men are very good at fighting with swords, with bow and arrow. They can fire old-fashioned arquebus guns, but they cannot act as an organized modern military. And so one of the members of the Iwakura mission, the sort of study abroad trip, Yamagata Aritomo, studied the military organization that he encountered in every country they visited. And he returns to Japan with a set of ideas about how to revise Japan's military to make it modern. And in 1873, as a result of his actions, a system of universal military conscription is decreed. In other words, a universal draft so that all men have to serve in the military is enacted. And there's great resistance to this. But the resistance is not from peasants or merchants or artisans. The resistance is from the samurai. They think, no, the right to wage war is our hereditary traditional right. We are the warriors of Japan. If everybody gets to carry a sword, the samurai become meaningless. There are actual, violent clashes that occur. But this is overcome, and soon every young man spends time in the military, which becomes a way of educating and socializing the new generation, the young generation of Meiji Japan, to be part of this modern nation. If you're wealthy, you can buy your way out of this. So if you're a rich kid, you don't have to serve in the army. Class distinctions are not erased by this military conscription policy. So another challenge is that, or a related challenge, is that the new Meiji government wants to turn this man, the traditional samurai, into this man, a businessman. And so they go through this gradual, careful plan of social transformation, where the warrior class is converted into modern citizens. First, they abolish the fine rankings that used to exist for the samurai. And they make all samurai either upper samurai or lower samurai. Then they take all the other social groups. So you may remember from the lecture I gave the last time I was here that everyone in Tokugawa Japan was divided up into these status categories. You have artisans, you have merchants, you have peasants, you have outcasts. All of those distinctions are abolished, and all those people are classified as commoners. Then they take the lower samurai and cram them into the commoner group. So there's only a small group of samurai left. They start to tax their stipends. They start to convert those stipends to bonds. And then finally, in 1876, this is only 8 years after the Meiji Restoration, samurai stipends are taken away. and samurai cut their distinctive hairstyles off and become modern men. So it only took 8 years, which is a pretty rapid and remarkable transformation, considering that the samurai had been the dominant political group in Japan for 700 years. Now, the new slogan of the government is written here, Fukoku Kyohei. This means enrich the country, strengthen the military. Again, this is very kind of bald, very just sort of in-your-face strategy. The Japanese did not want to be colonized. They wanted to be colonizers. They wanted to be a great power. In order to do that, they needed the money to fund a grand military. But they didn't know how to develop a thriving economy, right? The samurai, the Tokugawa, had carefully avoided involvement in commercial activity for centuries, and they didn't understand economics. So in addition to sending Japanese leaders out into the world to study, they brought experts in. They brought in technicians who could help the Japanese to set up a telegraph system in 1870, allowing rapid communication from one part of Japan to another. They brought in experts who had worked in the postal systems of foreign countries, who could help Japan to develop a modern postal system. They brought in experts in banking and finance, who could help create the modern currency, the yen, that still is the currency used in Japan today. They brought in engineers, entrepreneurs, inventors, who could help put in the first railroad, which connected Tokyo to Yokohama. You might know that today Japan has one of the best rail systems in the world. The bullet train, the Shinkansen, is a marvel to ride on. I wish we had trains like that here in the United States. That all dates back to this 1870s embrace of this foreign technology. Yeah, please.
And where did they bring these people in from?
So they hired them from America, from France, from England. And what's interesting is you can imagine if you were the best railroad engineer in America who had the best job, you would not get on a flea-infested steamship and sail halfway around the world to work in Japan. So often the people who they brought in were people who'd been fired, or people who had retired, or people who were running away from the law but had good technical knowledge or whatever. So it was kind of a hodgepodge mixed bunch of folks. But what's really interesting is that the Japanese hired these men, mostly, in some cases women, not just to come and build a lighthouse or set up a railroad, but to train the Japanese in the skills so that they could continue those practices themselves. And very quickly, the Japanese were producing train engines, and they were producing silk mills, and all of the kind of industrial apparatuses that would allow the country to be successful. They mastered those technologies. Now, there is one last gasp of traditional sentiment that occurred in the 1870s. You may have seen the movie The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise as an American who is hired to go to Japan as a foreign expert and train the military. So he is one of these, he is supposed to be one of these foreign experts brought in. In The Last Samurai, he's a Civil War veteran, an alcoholic, and he goes on this voyage to escape his memories of the atrocities that he took part in against Native Americans, if I remember correctly. So his particular story is not necessarily historically accurate, but the Satsuma Rebellion, the story of a samurai uprising against the modern monarchical Meiji state, is real. And basically, a member of the oligarchy, Saigo Takamori, who was a general, a military strategist, who had grown disaffected with the westernization that was taking part along with modernization, and retreated back to his home prefecture, he became a kind of magnet for disaffected samurai who joined him and eventually, despite his desire to retire in peace, started a rebellion against the Meiji government. This rebellion was crushed because the Meiji government now had a modern military. And even a bunch of handsome dudes wearing samurai armor, wielding swords, were not going to resist a modern military. But it's a fascinating moment in Japanese history when you have this conflict between old values and this rush to embrace new, modern, and in many cases, Western values. Yeah?
So were they crushed by modern weapons like the minigun or whatever?
Indeed. I think the representation of the conflict between a modern Japanese military and traditional, samurai on horseback and running around waving swords it's dramatized in the film, but it's fairly accurate. It's just not an equal fight. Can't bring a sword to a gunfight, I guess, basically. Japan continues its very rapid progress forward. In 1889, a constitution is passed. And it's interesting to note that this constitution was based on European models. So Japan had a parliamentary system with an upper house of lords and an elected lower house. It was particularly heavily influenced by German, Prussian models. So it didn't have good, balance, sort of set of checks and balances. And this played a role later in the rise of militarism and even of totalitarianism in the early 20th century in Japan. But still, the fact that a country that was forced to open its doors to the West at gunpoint in the 1850s, in 1889 passes a full-fledged modern constitution is pretty remarkable. And it shows the will, the absolute determination of Japanese elites in particular to become equals with the great powers of the West.
I think what's even more interesting about it is that they did it without having to do as much bloodshed as in the Western world.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
when it changed here, we had to go through a number of different, mortalities and
Yeah, yeah.
There, though they did have a few, was nowhere near as fast as
Absolutely.
Western world.
I agree. Please.
In part because it was the indigenous culture that was staving things off and then did the change, whereas here it was other people coming in and exploiting and oppressing the indigenous culture.
Probably so.
So they had to.
There was a strong, because Japan had been closed off from the outside world for more than 2 centuries, there was a pretty strong sense of national identity in Japan. There were divisions, there were status divisions and class divisions, but I think there was a kind of shared culture that allowed this modern project of saying we are one nation, we are one people, to go down easy. It was a diet that people were used to, in a sense. So the Japanese had learned in their travels around the world. Oh, please, go ahead.
Speaking of oneness, where are the buffer states in all this?
So that's a great question. The parts of Japan that were kind of fuzzy in the Tokugawa period, that were not in but were not out of the Tokugawa state. So Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, was called Ezo in the Tokugawa period, as you said, and was home to an indigenous population that was not Japanese, and that the Japanese treated as trading partners, but also as resources to be exploited, even during the Tokugawa period. So that only, sort of rapidly continued under the Meiji government. Ryukyu, the islands that we now call Okinawa, were conquered and absorbed into the modern nation. So, speaking of which, Japan recognized that if it wanted to be a strong modern power, it didn't only need a military, it needed colonial acquisitions. It needed to fuel its industrial revolution. It needed resources. It needed materials. It needed labor. And where did the great powers of the West get the people and the resources to fuel their modernization and their industrialization? From colonies, from slavery, right? From various forms of the exploitation of other places and other peoples. And Japan turned to its neighbors. In 1874, a very early instance of this was the Taiwan expedition, in which a ship was sent to punish a group of indigenous Taiwanese who had attacked a Japanese merchant, I think. And this was the first use of modern military might to kind of flex their muscles regionally that Japan engaged in. It was deemed to be successful, and it gave the green light for Japan to start interfering in the political and economic activities of their neighbors. Most notably, Japan became very, very interested in their closest neighbor, Korea. Now, Korea, as you can see from the map, is in between Japan and China, and was part of the Chinese tributary system. So Korea was protected by China, which was struggling to resist the imperialist activities of Great Britain and other European powers. So Korea was in theory protected under the Chinese umbrella, but China was struggling to protect even itself. So this meant that Korea was vulnerable to the activities of Japan. And Japan sent diplomats and merchants and also soldiers to protect the diplomats and merchants, who then could start to engage in aggressive activity in Korea. Ultimately, this led to an open conflict with China, fought on the Korean Peninsula and in this area to the north called the Liaodong Peninsula. So let me restate that. A war is fought between China and Japan over access to Korea and over the kind of control over and influence on Korea. So this is typical of imperialist and colonialist states, right? To ignore the needs and desires and wishes of the client state, in this case Korea, and instead only engage in either diplomacy or acts of war with other great powers. In other words, Japan was becoming a great power, right? Furthermore, Japan won. Japan comprehensively defeated China in this war. China, the greatest civilization and the largest country in all of Asia, was brought to its knees by tiny little Japan, who just a few decades before had been forced to sign the unequal treaties with the West. So Japan felt like, we've made it. This is our coming out party. This is when we announce ourselves to the world as a modern power. And in the negotiations with China that followed this war, they won all kinds of goodies. They won huge payments from the Chinese government. They won access to Korea. They won access to various port cities in China where they could build industrial factories. They gained the kind of unequal relationship with China that they had previously had from the other end of the equation with America. However, this is a great image before the however. This is a woodblock print, a triptych, that shows the Japanese as a well-organized modern military, very much looking like the Prussian army, as your instructor mentioned in our last class, waving the Japanese imperial flag. And look at the way this Japanese artist has represented the Chinese. They're buffoons. They're tripping over themselves. They're falling down. They can barely stand up straight. They're on fire, right? So this is pure propaganda. And it's showing that the Japanese have adopted Western racial and cultural hierarchies that usually put whites at the top, right? Now they're putting themselves at the top of that hierarchy by defeating their neighbors. So this all was a little too much for the Westerners to handle. Germany, France, and I believe England, these three great powers, intervened in the negotiations and said, congratulations, Japan, you won this war against this old fading Chinese power, but you're asking for too much in return. And they took away some of the winnings that Japan had negotiated in the treaty following the Sino-Japanese War. And they took them for themselves. They didn't want Japan to have full access to Chinese ports. They didn't want Japan to be in a superior position in the trading market in China. They wanted themselves to be in the superior position, right? So this is the first time in a way that a non-Western power had really risen up and started to challenge the West. And what do? They slapped Japan down. So you can imagine the reaction in Japan was outrage, riots in the streets. If they thought this was going to teach the Japanese a lesson, oh, well, I guess we shouldn't try to challenge the great powers anymore. The opposite lesson was learned. They were so angry and more determined than ever to become a great modern power. Now, while all of this is happening, I just want to mention the changes that are coming to Japan are not only occurring in the military, in the world of business, in diplomacy, but in the home as well. Women's roles are being redefined so that an ideal Japanese woman is no longer a kimono-wearing, sort of samurai wife, but a Victorian-style wife and mother who masters certain European arts and takes care of the children in the home. The real role of women in the Meiji period, though, that is often unacknowledged, is as laborers. The new industrial factories that Japanese industrialists were building, especially in the textile industry, needed cheap labor. And the labor they turned to was female and was rural. So poor farming women, often girls, daughters of farming families, who, needed to make money for their families, became workers in these silk mills. And silk was one of the most important exports of this period. Devastatingly harsh conditions. But in some ways, Japan's success as an empire was fueled by the labor of Japanese women, which is often not given, I think, the attention it deserves. So another great power that was interested in Korea was Russia. Remember that Russia is to the north of Manchuria and Korea. And Russia, in this period, was going through its own age of political chaos, but knew that it was interested in the natural resources of Manchuria and Korea, the mineral deposits, the forests, and it wanted to have access to this entire region freely. Japan also wanted access to those mineral deposits, and this led to another war being fought over access to Korea on Korean and Chinese territory. And again, much to the surprise of the world, Japan was victorious. In 1905, when the Russians surrendered and signed a treaty with the Japanese, the world stood in awe that a non-white, non-Western nation had defeated a great European power. This was a new moment in the modern history of the world. And it really is a fascinating moment to think about from different perspectives. So imagine, for example, that you live in Vietnam and you suffer under the rule of a French colonial regime. And you hear that an Asian nation has fought off a mighty European empire and has defeated them in battle. You're not going to think about the poor Koreans who are going to suffer under Japanese rule. You're going to think this shows that Western colonialism can be defeated, right? And revolutionary movements all over the world are spawned in this moment. This is a moment when people think that they can resist. And that's inspirational. The Indian independence movement that ultimately led to, in the 20th century, to India being freed from British colonial rule, those leaders said that they were inspired by the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War. But ironically, this also spelled the end of freedom for the Korean people, because there was no one left to oppose the Japanese in Korea. And in 1910, Korea was annexed as a formal colony of Japan. So if you lived in Korea after 1910, you had to take a Japanese name. You had to learn Japanese in school. You had to worship at Japanese Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. Young women were often recruited into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. And for 35 years, until the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was brutally ruled under the dark umbrella, this age is sometimes called in a Korean context. So this moment, the defeat of the Russians in 1905, that's an inspiration for colonized peoples in some parts of the world, also begins the worst colonial era for Korea. And it's an example of how this isn't a real black and white story, because Japan was itself trying to resist Western imperialism in becoming a great power. They were using the tools of the age, right? But in doing so, they were committing the crimes that they themselves were trying to avoid. Yeah, please.
Well, yeah, just that you said brutally ruled by Japan, but they were just basically doing what the white people were doing.
Absolutely. But one of the things that is really helpful about the story of Japan's successful and rapid modernization is that it's a reminder that global history is complicated. And global history is not only the story of Europe going out and conquering other places. There's resistance, there's revolution, there's nationalism, there's internationalism, right? There are all kinds of counter-narratives that rise up all over the world. Japan's case is unusual in that they were so successful. And until the rise of China recently, unquestionably the most successful non-Western culture in the world. Japan had the second largest economy in the world after the United States until I think the late 1990s. So Japan really was number 2 in the world until very recently. But at great cost. At great cost to the Korean people. Taiwan also became a colony. Manchuria was partially colonized. The indigenous peoples of Ezo, the Ryukyuan people in what is now Okinawa, the various parts of China that were invaded and devastated during World War II, our own American soldiers who fought against Japan in the Pacific Theater, right? So it's a story that doesn't have, I think, clear winners and losers, but at the very least complicates the story of modernization that I think we usually hear. Yeah, you had a question?
I guess more of a statement.
Please.
An observation.
Yeah.
I guess not knowing history, you don't know why certain places have the stance that they have on today. And when you look back, you see how power has changed hands.
Yeah.
And the fight for power has, if you're at the bottom of the hill, stuff rolls downhill until you change your position on the hill.
Yeah.
Then you don't get blanked on anymore.
Yeah. I mean, China is a perfect example of that, right? Today, China is probably the other great power in the world other than the United States, right? And has such a rapidly growing economy, is a military force to be reckoned with. China probably would have risen to prominence much sooner in the 20th century if it hadn't been devastated by Japan during World War II, right? That, in some ways, was one of the reasons the Communist Revolution happened in China, the separation of China and Taiwan. So many things can be traced back to Japan's activities as a great power in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yeah.
What about the Pearl Harbor attack? Was that predicated by anything that Japan may have thought or done in
Well, earlier, one of your classmates asked, did the Japanese have a negative attitude towards America because of its role in forcing Tokugawa-era Japan to open its doors to the outside world? And I think mostly the answer is no. Mostly the answer is that once Japan started to modernize, they didn't hold any grudges. They just wanted to avoid being oppressed, and they did. But on the other hand, Japan didn't ever feel that in the modern world it could trust the United States or could trust Great Britain. For example, during the Pacific War, Japan used the stories of Jim Crow era racism as an example of why America should be defeated. This is a country that exploits people who are black or who are Asian, you know, and that was part of the Japanese war machine. Was propaganda that was also true, right, about racial inequity in America. So indeed, I don't think that's a grudge based on the Meiji Restoration, but they were very aware of the weaknesses in the government and the culture of their enemy, and used that to their advantage. And they claimed to be freeing Asia of white imperialism. That was their goal, and replacing it, though, with Japanese dominance. Yes?
I mean, in retrospect, you can kind of sort of see if China would have been a more developed country sooner had it not been for the Japanese strain. Well, you can kind of pinpoint it to Western
Absolutely.
culture.
Sure.
Because had they just left Japan alone and let them live how they wanted to, they wouldn't have felt the need to figure out how to survive in this new world.
Sure.
Western civilization has kind of pushed on them.
Sure.
You know, they say European most owned or conquered most of the world at that time.
Yeah.
Pretty much America is just an extension of
Sure.
European rule. It just wasn't happening in one particular regime, but kind of did the same thing
Yeah.
in its own right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, one question that students sometimes ask is, why was Japan the country in Asia to modernize so quickly and so effectively? Why not China, or why not Korea? And I think one of the answers is actually that the Chinese structure was so strong and so robust. The Chinese tributary system was a great diplomatic system that endured for 1,000 years. And China had such a strong sense of its own culture and civilization. And it didn't want Western technology or Western goodies. It was happy to continue successfully engaging in exchange with tributary nations as it had done for so long. And so it was slower to resist, whereas Tokugawa Japan was fragile. That policy of isolationism, that income disparity between samurai and merchants, that couldn't last. But the timing was lucky. Japan collapsed just at the moment when it could start to embrace modern technology. It could take part in the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't following the West. It was on the same path as the West, industrializing along with England, along with America, and then that put them way out in front of China and Korea.
Happened sooner, they probably would not have been as successful.
Exactly. That's just luck. I mean, that's just the contingency of history. Yeah, we're almost out of time.
I have two questions.
Yes, please.
At what point did a lot of Japanese people start to emigrate,
Mm.
come to the United States, and then was that part of the whole racial fear thing that ended up leading to people being incarcerated during World War II?
Sure. Thank you. So Japanese emigration out of the home islands and to the Americas started in the late 19th century, but really picked up in the early 20th century. There were a lot of losers in Japan's modernization and industrialization. I mean, Japan became a capitalist society, and as we know, some people win in the game of capitalism, and a lot of people don't. And so you find laborers and agriculturalists, and in some cases people just seeking new experiences, who migrated to places like Brazil and Peru, to Hawaii, and to the United States, particularly on the West Coast. And started businesses, became farmers, and despite the various forms of anti-immigrant sentiment and racist exclusionary policies of the early 20th century, were largely very successful in Hawaii and on the West Coast. I mean, the story of the internment of Japanese Americans is a complicated one that I can't get into now. I think it had more to do with the racial discourses in some ways of the early 20th century in America than it does to do with the story I've been telling today. I mean, as we know, Germans and Italians were not incarcerated. I think it was really that Japanese were racial others and therefore could and should be corralled in some way that led to that terrible crime being committed.
And so I guess my question had to do more with the idea that there was such a fear among the white Europeans that this race of other could
Yellow peril thinking
yeah,
kind of.
Yeah. And so that sort of translated into when they came to the United States to still consider them not just other racially, but scary politically.
Sure, maybe so. I mean, the truth is, that's the realm of my colleagues in American history. I'm better with the samurai than I am with the Asian Exclusion Act and that kind of stuff. But these are good questions. So we're almost out of time. Any final questions or comments from anyone? Yes, please.
So when Harry or Paris, I can't remember his name, the first contact with the Japanese, like, wasn't there a big language barrier? Did he have like a translator with him?
He did. So I'm sorry to say that I'm a little rusty on the exact makeup of the Perry expedition, but I think he had translators who were Chinese. And remember that Chinese and Japanese languages are totally different, but the scripts are very similar, and so they can communicate through writing. There may also have been interpreters who had been in Nagasaki, Chinese interpreters who had lived in Nagasaki and spoke some Japanese. So they took advantage of the connections that the Tokugawa did have with the outside world to find translators. Other questions or comments? In some ways, the larger point that I just want to reiterate is that this is a really remarkable 50 years, right? So 1868, the Tokugawa are overthrown, and this 15-year-old emperor is put on the throne. 1910, Japan has beat China in a war, beat Russia in a war, and taken Taiwan and Korea as colonies. And the Meiji emperor dies in 1912. So that's all one period, 1868 to 1912. Japan goes from being at the wrong end of an unequal treaty to one of the great powers of the world. That's a pretty amazing story. Not necessarily a heroic story, not one that should be celebrated, but I think is worth knowing. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.